Okay, good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 2. We're on page 1160. And he's now going to be tying everything together all the way back from the beginning of the subject that began with Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton. So what we learned yesterday was essentially tying up some knots and explaining the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. So we're talking about an Eira Leki now, a divine energy that relates to existence, or the way he put it, Asara Mamoris Nivra Elam. So Asara Mamoris right away tells you that the Eibush is speaking specifics. He didn't just say, hey, poof, Breishis Bara Lekim Shemaim V'Saaretz. Asara Mamoris, specific details, Yehi Eir, Yehi Rakia. So clearly you see from that it's what he called Dibur, that it's a Lakus, as it's the Eira Leki, the Chayes of the key, that's relating to existence. That's in other words, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. And its focus is the creation, the product, not the focus only on what the Eibishter wants. And that's why the Ayin here has a different meaning. So the last thing we learned, that he compared this, he said, to the bittul of the Kalim, of Iyu v'garmuhi chad. So on one hand, the Ihu, the real Mahava, is obviously the creator. There's only one Eibishter. There's only one creator. But there's a creative process. That's the key thing to remember. There's a creator and there's a creative process that the creator has put into place, how he wants the creation to happen, like we've talked many times, because he wants us to understand it as much as possible and to be able to connect it as much as possible. So like he says a number of times, he says these words. He says, I just want to go back to a word that he used. It was many times. Bottom of page 1159. The truth is, Isavus is rooted in the Eir, like he says in the Geras HaKedesh, that's Dovuk and attached. Me'ein hamoyer, so it carries the koyach habriya from the Eibishter through Eir, which is the highest levels of Eir, the Eir of the Ayin of the Yesh Hamiti. But then he says, Rakesav is bepeil. That's the key word. Hisav is bepeil. Bepeil, meaning the actual process, is in a way of koyach hapeil benifel. Doesn't use those words here, but he used those words earlier. Huma eshem islapsus b'chinas malchus. So if you ask the questions, 1 second, if it's all going back to the Beira and the Eir that reflects the Beira's koyach hamahava, why we have a Ayin of Yesh HaNivra? Because there's a process where the Eibishter wants us to relate to he wants a divine energy that relates to existence. That's Asara Mamoris, the Dibur, which is informed by higher levels. So this he says, this is how it appeals the Eris Slapshus in Malchus. And this he calls that's connected to Misper. So he says this ha'ara is miyichud de'iyu v'garmuhi. This ha'ara animshachas ma'iyichud de'iyu v'garmuhi. But the iyu itself is the koyach hamahave, kol yachol, which is a level of bli misper. And that's the eir hadavuk. So you have the like bli misper because it's reflective of atzmos. That's the koyach habayra, koyach hamahave. And then there's the bechinas asapshus be'esis v'kelim de malchus. That's already ya'arid iyu misyachid im garmuhi. That's how the Eir Leki is connecting to kelim. Is that Zoh, ha'arid Zoh shemer b'malchus l'tzedech esavos. Remember, we spoke about the Dibur when it's still b'chemdes halev, before it actually expresses itself in speech, when it's still so it's still encompassed within the source, so to speak, relatively speaking, because Zoh obviously is not the Ayin of the Yesh Hamiti, but Lefiyerech Malchus, it's a higher level. And in Malchus, so even when Malchus goes down to Biyah, it's still united with what it came from. So basically, the misper is coming from the bli misper. Because the dibur ain't gamma dibur ain't ifrit. Okay. Then the final thing we learned, before we're going to go now to the summation of it all, is that this is mishtana. It's not just it goes down a level, it actually changes. Its personality changes to some extent as it goes into Malchus, like the moon from the sun. It's not just the sun, a diminished sun. The moon is a different type of light. In quality, it's a different type of light. So it's a reflection of the sun, but it changed. It went through some type of change. And that tells, he says, excuse me. I'm going to continue reading line 6 on top of page 1160. Aleph Kusam. He says, the Eir is in a state of complete absorption or attached to its source. There's no shinui. Even the 4 levels we discussed, whether the bitl of head the tfisa smokim, like shrago batira, the candle and light of the sun, or the level of ein zuloscha, that the Eir senses that its entire being is only due to its source, or the efes biltecha, that this is not existent, because it's completely just the source expressing itself through level, that how the source bit 2, all those 4 levels, there's no shinui, because the Eir, all it is of Elikus. Just the question is to what intense and how level and how deep it is. But when you talk about the Eir of the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra, the one that becomes Asarim Amoris, the Asius and the Kalim and the Eiris of Malchus, where even the Eir also is now adapting itself and relating to existence, that's like the sun, that's like the moonlight. That goes through a shin. So Eir Dovik is not subject to change. Ein shin klal. That it can change. And the fact that it changes is because it's not in the full dveikus. Now we explained what dveikus means here. It's still connected. First of all, it gets renewed. Remember, it's renewable energy, so it's always connected to the source. And secondly, this level is still, this of the Yesh Nivra is still connected to the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti. The moon is still a reflection of the sun, but it went through a shift. And that shift is, in our context, is that it relates to existence. So basically, you have a Eir Eliki, level of Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, which only expresses godliness, and you have an Ayin of Yesh Nivra, which is the godliness as it relates to existence. It's still Ayin, like he's going to say now. Okay. Then the parentheses, I'll just go over the parentheses as well. That earlier we explained, Le'elon is boyer, the Yeshlem, the Malchus Moshe Batzilus, Bechinis Moyer HaGadol. So that tells you that Malchus and Atzilus is considered a Moyer HaGadol, even though it's a Levana, but it's still the Levana as it was initially in the state of being a large luminary like the sun. And Kos says how do you reconcile that? Because that's Primis HaMalchus. But Chetzenis HaMalchus, Nasa Mokl Be'ah, has the Bechinis Moyer HaKod. Okay. So Malchus itself has 2 stages, so to speak, or 2 levels. One as it's still a Makabel, and it's still, one as it's still in Atzilus, and therefore still has that Moyer HaGodel element in it, and one as it comes into Biyah as a Moyer HaKotten. But regardless, it does go through some change, even though it's still a reflection, still a light. Now you could ask a question. If it's Oyer, what difference does it make? Oyer, the lowest level of Oyer is still not a Keli. So what do you mean change? Doesn't the lowest level of Oyer have the same properties that the highest level of Oyer has? So the answer is, we've learned at length in Ayin Beis that both are true. Obviously, it still retains the quality. That's why it's an Ayin. It's an Ayin of the Yesh Nivra. And it's still a Chayes Eir Eliki. But it's an Eir Eliki that has now assumed, like you could say, the code of existence. In it is embedded what Yehi Eir, Yehi Rekiya. So it's an Eir, it's still being an Eir Eliki, but it's an Eir Eliki that identifies with existence. Like somewhat like we learned about the Eiris Mitsuyarim and Eiris Pshutim. The Eiris Pshutim are, but there's a stage where the Eir receives some type of seer. It's still not a Keli. It's still not the Yesh. It's still not existent. The Eir HaChesed, the Eir HaGvura. Just to explain that for a moment. Okay.
This is Ein Boy Dveikus.
This is what?
Ein Boy Dveikus.
Correct. Lefierech, basically. It's like, again, it's what I said with its focus is not Elikus. Its focus is what Elikus wants, which is the creation of existence. Okay. Ma'achar sha'ara zu ein b'chinas dveikus. So I'm continuing reading. Even though we read this, I'll read it again. And being that this reflection is not in a state of dveikus, obviously in relation to the Eir HaDavuk, the higher level, im kein ma shenikra ayin. So now why it's called ayin, the higher level of ayin, because of dveikus, because it's attached, it's completely nullified by the source on all four levels. Here, because it's not dveikus, the meaning of ayin does not mean nullified. We're not talking about being completely in the presence of its source. Actually, so that's what it means now. So the Eir is still Eliki, but because, so on one hand, it's still an Eir Eliki, but on the other hand, because Dveikus, but on the other hand, you can't call it Yesh, so it maintains its ayin. So on one hand, it's lower than the light, the energy that's attached. But on the other hand, who compared to Mitzias Hayesh. So now we have in the world of our existence, we have so we have something to work toward. The higher level of Eir is completely nullified. And like he said, if the Eir is completely nullified, it can't create existence. So that's the paradox here. If you remember, he said that the Eir can't be called a Mokar Liyesh. You can't call the Ayin Amiti, that Ayin that's Dovuk, a Mokar Liyesh, because these words he used just here. The bottom of page 1158, he says, Ayin Ein Beged Mokar Liyesh, that Mashu B'chinas Hedem Etzias, Echie B'chinas Mokar L'Dover Ma. If it's Hedem Etzias, if it fundamentally is an Ayin that doesn't exist because it's completely bottled to its source, how could it become a source for anything? Its entire focus is its source. It's only looking up. So you have to say there's a level of ayin that is looking down, but it's still ayin. It's still elikus. But now it's an elikus that you can at least say, I'm relating to existence. So there you have on both sides of the interface. You have the ayin of the Yesh Amiti, that as we learned earlier, is all about revealing atzmus, revealing elikus, godliness, and you have the ayin of the Yesh Amiti, it's related to the function. But from a point of view of the Yesh, it's not Metzias Dover because it's beyond us. So it's a very different function, this level, the lower level of Ayin, the second level of Ayin, than the first Ayin, level of Ayin.
It's still called oil because the Hishavus is Melubashenem, the Koyach Hishavus.
Yeah, and remember, it's still not Shaykh to go against God in any way. It's not like the Yesh, Nifrid, that the Yesh can say, this earth doesn't have Bchira. This earth does not have the ability to do what God doesn't want it to do. It's Eir, but it's focused on existence. That's the point. So in other words, in the Lakus itself, like we learned about the whole levels between Ratzon Kloli and Ratzon Prati and the Ratzon HaKodum, that in the Lakus itself, God is identifying, relating to existence. Look, this is so vital, and that's why I want to elaborate a bit more. I always mention this. The Gemara says, Kosher zivugan kosher kizuvgan kekriyas yamsuf. Right? Zivugim are kosher kekriyas yamsuf. A marriage is as difficult as parting the sea. So Chassidus asks a question. What does that mean? For the Eibishter, it's difficult to part the sea. He created the sea. He created land. What does it take for him to part the sea? He's the creator of it all. It doesn't even have to do anything to split and part, and you have a kriyas yamsuf. So of course the answer is because in the Seder Ishtalshus that the Eibishter Rola B'Ritzeinei, he wants a Ishtalshus. He wants Yam. He wants Yabosha. That's also part of the Kavanah. It's not man-made. That's God's creation. The difference between Yam and Yabosha. God created this distinction. So the distinction is also divine. And as such, the Eibishter bound himself kav yochel. So obviously there's a level of elikus kol yochel. He could do whatever he wants. And he doesn't even have to send a wind to make the water stand like a wall. He needs a wind. He created the whole thing. Because the Eibishter bound himself to the laws of nature that he created. So we say that's elikus as it relates to existence, to the point that the Eibishter himself will not suspend nature, except in rare instances. Even the Mabul, where Leishim Sham Mazolis, and there was a suspension of time, the Mazolis, the sun, the moon, they all stopped moving. But the Eibishter didn't stop everything. He still brought a Mabul. It was water. He destroyed the world within the world. It was miraculous, but it was all within the world of nature. He didn't just say, I don't want existence. Like he says in Shari Yechid Amun, if he stopped 1 second saying, B'dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, 1 second, the whole thing stops. That's not what he wanted. Even the Mabul, he didn't want to completely make it like Kedem Sheshis Shemei Bereshis. So my point is, there's a lot of importance. The Alter Rebbe, when he was going, and he asked this, the guy was writing, when he was arrested, he wanted to be Mekadosh Levana. The Rebbe brings it very often. So the captain didn't want to stop the boat that night. The Alter Rebbe did miraculously stop the boat. Then he let it go and let it continue, and the captain then stopped the boat for him. So the Rebbe asked the question, obvious question: if the Alter Rebbe could stop the boat himself and let him be Mekadosh Levana, what does he need to prove, to make kunsten here, to make a trick, to show he can do it? But then the captain, because a mitzvah has to be done b'derech hateva. Now you could say, what difference does it make? You're doing the mitzvah. Because the Eibishter me'ezes sibim, not getting into the reason. Obviously the reason is dira b'tachtenim, and the mystery of why God created existence in the first place. So don't dismiss the fact that Eibishter wants the structure of existence. The ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is still a lakus, but it's an lakus that's completely identifying with the structure of existence. And it's bound to it. Not in a way, God forbid, that EF Shalahetzias Kalov, by the Maraglim, what the Maraglim said, that he's unable to free himself. He wants to be there because he wants existence. You could say, look how far, the extent God goes. Kosher Kikriyas Yamsuf, stopping the boat. Everything is always b'derech hateva. Even the biggest miracles are always coming with some natural element to them. So that must tell us that God is absolutely insistent. He does not want to change nature wherever possible. Wherever it's not possible, whatever the reason, he does something that is miraculous. But even the greatest miracles are all done within some type of tfisa of existence. So I just wanted to make the point that this Eira Leki is talking about is not to be dismissed. It has a very important shlichus. But its shlichus is not about dvekus. Its shlichus is about getting the job done. And whatever that job is, to keep the yam as it is, to keep the abosha, yehi rakia, and so on. That is its purpose, is to keep lo yush besu, that this existence should not be suspended, that lo yush besu yom v'layla, day and night, sun and moon, all the movements, all of natural nature, this very structured existence and all its routines and patterns are all divinely ordained. Remember, we learned about Morabu Masach Hashem, Mogadlu Masach Hashem, Tzva Hashemayim, Tzva Aretz, all the movements, down to the very way a leaf turns in the wind, is all about Hashgacha Pratis. That means there's a divine energy very invested in the structure. I just wanted to elaborate more because it could seem almost here that it's like that, almost you could dismiss it, but it's not the case. There's a very important role this ayin of the Yesh HaNivra plays. And especially in the Mamutza, that's why it's so beautiful, because now you think of it this way. There's the Yesh HaMiti, Yesh HaNivra. The ayin of the Yesh HaMiti is reflecting a lakus in all the levels. The ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is helping us ultimately to come appreciate that there's something that drives us, but it's still a lakus, it's lei dover, and it's lei musag, like he said earlier. He calls it l'gabe mitzisa. So it gives us something to hold on to. So the paradox of the ayin Yesh HaNivra is very interesting, because on one hand it remains a lakus and beyond us. On the other hand, it relates to us. But we have to learn that, because on our own we don't see it, like he explained. Anyway, so I just wanted to give it a little more, it's called body, to understand. Now, now he says like this. Ulegabe madrega zu, hayesh tefes mokim. So this is perfect segue. Legabe this madrega, which madrega? The ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, which is called ayin because it's le mitzias, because it's the words loy dover legabe mitzias hayesh. So you think it's completely beyond us. No, it's not completely beyond us. It's we don't see it as a mitzias dover. But legabe the madregas hayesh tefes mokim. That's why the Alter Rebbe said, you must stop the boat. It was not a small matter for him. It was because it has to be that the Yesh itself, that this should not be driven by something miraculous that's beyond it. In other words, we rechenzech with the Yesh, that the mitzvah has to be done b'derech hateva, and the other examples I gave. So therefore, l'gab madregas hayesh tefes mokim, the Yesh and everything that is tefes mokim, it has value. L'gab the ayin of the Yesh amiti, the world does not tefes mokim at all. Okay. V'nitfes v'nislabish b'hayesh. I think these are very important key lines. So the Yesh is tefes mokim. This Yehi Oyer, the Eibush is saying Yehi Oyer means that Oyer is tefes mokim, Er Gashmi, and Yehi Rakia. And furthermore, the ayin Yesh tefes mokim v'nitfes v'nislabish, and the ayin is nitfes. It's contained by and in a sense. The nitfus means, we always talk about nitfus, contained by, defined by, identified by, v'nislabish by yesh, and it's mislabish, like a garment. It doesn't remain.
Nitfas is having a hold, a grab. Mislabish is be proteus, be pneumius.
Yeah. Nitfus means it's bound to it. Mislabish means it manifests itself in like a lavush, where you actually are internalized and enclosed in it, b'hayesh. Okay. So that's the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. Now he's going to continue. Valkain, and therefore, this is vital now. Hubchinas Daas Tachton, the ma'ayin liyesh. And that's why this level is the state of Daas Tachton. In other words, the perspective as the Yesh sees things. This ayin is seeing things through the eyes of the Yesh as well. The ma'ayin liyesh. Because it's an ayin that's identifying and going into a Yesh. So yes, the ayin still remains an ayin. It's still an eir eliki, and it's lei dover hu, lei b'chinas lei dover legab mitzias hayesh. But since it relates to the Yesh, so going back to the story of the Alter Rebbe, it was so important to do the mitzvah b'derech hateva, because it wasn't about just the mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that rechenzich and is bislapshus b'derech hateva. Exactly, it's nitfus and mislabish. So it's not just an incidental thing. It's necessary to do the mitzvah on the terms of existence, not on the terms of the Alter Rebbe and the terms of Daas Elyon. Daas Elyon, of course, he could have stopped the boat, and he did. But it has to work through the rules and through that govern nature itself. That's why mitzvahs are not meant to be done with miracles. It has to be done b'derech hateva and so on. It's the whole question actually about Ner Chanukah with that. because the Cheder Ner Chanukah was a miraculous Ner, until after 8 days when they were able to procure fresh new olive oil. So there's a whole pilpul on this. By who's the pilpul? I think it's not the Ran. Who's
talking about it. That was not even Shemen Zayis. It was Shemen Nes.
Beis Yosef. It brought in Beis Yosef, basically.
Yeah,
that's what the Sikha says.
But there's a Shagas. Who discusses at length? We got it already. Okay. It's a Shemen Nisi, not Shemen Tivi. But regardless, but you see from the Shakavitari, because you're not supposed to do a mitzvah with a miracle. It's supposed to be. Why is that so important? Because that's the Dira B'Tachteim. The Eibishter wants it Shiur HaNivra. So this is why he calls this Ayin is a Daas Tachton Ayin. Remember the beginning, he said Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton, Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton. First was the Yesh HaMiti and Yesh HaNivra. The perspective from the Yesh HaMiti is that he's the true Yesh, the true reality, absolute reality, and existence is Ayin. Yesh to Ayin. The perspective from below is we are the Yesh, we exist, and the Elikus is a mystery, Ayin. But then he said, Kel Daas Havaya. Both Deis are in Havaya, in Elikus, in Ayin itself. So he explained that the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, it also has the perspective of Daas Elyon, the 4 different levels we learned, and the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra has the perspective of the Yesh HaNivra from Daas Tachton. How Elikus relates to existence, like he said here, it's Teifus Mokim, it's Nitfus, and it's Slabish Boy. So the Ayin itself assumes a certain Daas Tachton perspective, which means, just to talk in language of Chassidim, did the Rebbe know us from Daas Elyon or Daas Tachton? So you would think Daas Elyon is the highest level. It's not correct, because Daas Elyon is like looking from the bird's eye view. Daas Tachton means seeing it from our perspective as well. You want a Rebbe that sees also us as we are in our state, not just how he sees us, the way Atzmus sees us, from Lamayla Lamata, that he could be with us, and within us, seeing us and being with us can elevate us. That's the Daas Tachton, mile of Daas Tachton, that it sees it and relates to our perspective.
He's saying about the Rebbe Maharash that he had a very big problem to see the world, and the two nuschos. The Tzemach Tzedek gave him a cane. He should be able to nislabish v'am b'olam hazeh. And another nuschah, the Tzemach Tzedek chazot for him 250 ma'amorim until he was able to see also the Daas Tachton.
Right. And that explains why many times the Rebbe, the Rabbeim, they wanted to know, you could say, why they had Ruach HaKodesh. Why didn't they just use Ruach HaKodesh all the time? Why do they need to hear a duch, or you have to give them a report and they ask questions? Because the chiddush here is to see it also within the perspective of existence, not just to bring a perspective from all the way from the above. You really want to have the chibur of Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton, but Daas Tachton is vital. So he said this is therefore the level of Ayin, the Yesh HaNivra has a Daas Tachton element, which is interesting because it's not just that the Yesh sees things that way, even the Eira Leki that relates to the Yesh in a way is our representative. So in a way you could say almost like when we're mispalel for something, for Bona Chaim Ezena, Revicha. So you could say, okay, we're mispalel to God, He should give us our thing. But if you have a level of godliness that relates to us, it's like you almost have an attorney, a representative that represents you and understands your situation from within. It's a far deeper relationship then. It's not just, you ask God for a blessing, He sends you a blessing. That it's part of the creation. And we say, Shchinte begalusa, ime anechi b'tzara, etc. In other words, even the Shechina, some way, has a dimension that relates to us and is with us. Not just from the top down.
This is fascinating. This gives me an understanding. When Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, go tell Bnei Israel they should accept me before Matan Torah, and it said, Nasa v'nishma, then it said that, Vayoshem Moshe es divrei ha'om el Hashem. Moshe came and he told Hashem. Rashi is asking, the Eibishter doesn't know. That you have to go and you have to tell Hashem.
This is This is one of the most fundamental principles of Chassidus in Torah Eir Vayera. It says the question Erdana. When Sodom was sinning, the Eibishter says Erdana. What's the lashon? Hiksasosa. Let's go down. Let's go down and see their cry, their anguish. What's the Erdana? God has to go down to see something. He can't see it from above. So Chassidus explains that's Atzilus. That's the essence of it. The Eibishter being mislabish, in the Elokus being mislabish in Welt, to see it from within, not just a bird's eye view from another reality. Yeah, that's a whole beard on that. Pasach Elyon, the Maimon Pasach Elyon in Torah Eir. The Rebbe Rashab has a Maimon Tafresh Nun Ches, the Hagos on it, where it explains this in depth. It's really the theme of Ayin Beis very much, the interface. That's not just God looking from above, it's God. Aremimcha lekai hamelech. It's not just Aremimcha. Aremimcha is coming into Lekai hamelech, and the Lekai hamelech is being elevated to Aremimcha. This is the crux of the whole interface essence, that you have to have both elements here. Okay. In a way, you could say, therefore, that when the Rebbe asks something mitzad Daas Tachton, or like you just said, the story with the Eibishter says he wants to hear it from their perspective, in a way it's even deeper than when they see it from above. They see it from above, my kamashmalan. Obviously, the Eibishter, a Novi, a Rebbe, can see things from above. The Chiddush is that can relate to us and also see it from our perspective, and then bring also that higher perspective. That's far deeper Chiddush, because you want them within us. You don't want just... I remember after the Rebbe started speaking about Mashiach, to say when he started intensifying, saying the world is ready, all we have to do is open our eyes, we already polished the buttons, all that expressions in the early 90s, in the Nun Aleph, Nun Beis. So I remember someone by Fabrengen, I was Fabrengen, someone says to me, what world does the Rebbe see? The world the Rebbe sees is not the world we see. He says the world is ready. Where do we see that it's ready? So I not that I had a tantrum, but I feigned feigned indignation. I said to him, how could you say such a thing? That a Rebbe is given to us in this world to see it from our, not just he's telling us, what do we need a Rebbe for if we're going to say that it's not the world we know? The Eibush also talks about a higher world. You want a Rebbe who's in our world, he's saying even on our terms we see the world is ready. Not that the Rebbe sees another world, then we're that's not the point. The point is that he's telling us that if you look closely, you'll see it also on your terms, which of course is so much richer and so much more pneumius. Okay. Now, so we start. Daas Tachton de Ayin Yesh. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to bring together everything we learned. And you're seeing now how the Oyer itself, the Ayin itself, carries Daas Tachton and now also Daas Elyon. So he says like this, Dihine, because now, Beis Deis Anal, these two perspectives, is Daas Elyon. In the Beis Deis Anal, Daas Elyon who Melmaila Lamata. That's from the top down. The Hainu She'ein Sof Hu Yesh Amiti. That Ein Sof is the true Yesh. Here he means Atzmus Ein Sof is the true reality, the absolute existence. V'kula kamei kalo chashiv. And everything before him is loy, is like kilo, is like nothing. It's considered like nothing. Like we learned, the ayin is completely bottled. And the Daas Tachton, the second perspective is Shu Das HaMakabel. That's the perspective of the recipient. This is from the bottom up. Shalamata Yesh. The Yesh is the Nivra, the creator, the creation is a Yesh. Ulamayla Ayin. And Lamayla is an Ayin, meaning unknowable, not of our Metzias, beyond us. Okay. The Nigan was a little different. I should have sang it like this. These 2 days, Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton, Daas Elyon, good. So it's not just the two perspectives, the Yesh Amiti and the Yesh Anivra. These two Daas you also have in Elikus itself. Not just in Atzmus, the creator, and the creation, in Elikus, which is the Ayin, the Emtza, you have these two. What does he say? The Daas Elyon, Shehi Ba'ara Shebibchinas Dveikus, that in the Daas Elyon, which is in the Ha'ara, in the reflection, that's in the state of Dveikus, the higher Oyer, attached. Hadeihi Kamoy Be'Ein Sof. There the perspective is like it's an Ein Sof. Yesh Amiti Shalamayla, Ulamata Ayin. Below
He's
they
saying,
say that
yes.
word Shalamayla, Yesh, Ulamata Ayin. That's the footnote. But Al Kaponim, what he's saying now is not just the Yesh Amiti has that day. The Elikus itself, the higher level of the Ayin, has also that day. That what? That's like the day in Ein Sof. Ein Sofi means your Atzmus Ein Sof. That the Yesh Amiti, Shalamayla Yesh Ulamata Ayin, canal. So he's also, that Ayin also has that perspective. That Lamayla is a Yesh, the true reality, and below everything is nullified, which is of course the perspective that introduces Bittul into existence. V'hainu, this means, Sha'ir Atzmehu B'chinas Ayin. In other words, not just that Atzmus, L'gabe Atzmus, the Oir is Ayin. The Oir itself embodies and personifies Bittul, Ayin. V'chein kol ma shenisava hakol b'chinas Ayin, the koloch choshev mamish. So the Oir itself is in a state of Ayin, and it introduces and sees everything. That everything that's created is in a state of Ayin, because it's all nullified, mamish nullified before him, koloch choshev. That's Daas Elyon. So what do we establish now? Daas Elyon is in the higher level of the Ayin of Ayin Eliki. And now what Daas Tachton, Shehi B'ha'ara Shebibchinas Moker Yesh. Now in Daas Tachton, which is in the Ha'ara, the reflection, that's already a Moker. It already relates to, as I consider, a source for creation, for the Yesh. Hadei Kamoy Daas HaMakabel. There the Deya, the Das, is like the Daas HaMakabel. It relates, it sees everything from the perspective of the recipient. Shalamata Yesh, Ulamayla Ayin. That Lamata is the Yesh, not Lamayla is the Yesh. Lamata, that's the Yesh, the created Yesh, and above that is Ayin. So this is a tremendous chiddush, that Elikus itself sees it that way. You usually don't hear that. You usually hear Elikus sees everything, Lamayla Lamata. That Lamayla is the Yesh, and we are the Ayin. And we see it. He's saying here, the Ayin that relates and is a source for the Yesh, even though it's an Ayin Eliki, it sees it like we see it, from Daas Tachton perspective. So you have a Daas Tachton in Keil Deus Havaya. Havaya can also see it that way. Elikus can see the world the way we see the world. Obviously, in a pure form and in a true form, we can also see illusions and we can deceive ourselves. And we're a Yesh. And so, the Ayin Eliki of the Yesh, Hanivra, knows there's a God, that knows its godliness, but it sees the perspective from so-called, that there's a Yesh, and that Yesh is created by the Ayin, which is beyond the Yesh. Yeah, but now even Elikus sees it that way. That's the point. That in other words, it's like the teacher is able to see Das HaMakabel. Usually you say the teacher presents the Das HaMashpia, the perspective of the Mashpia. The Makabel, the student, sees it from the student. But to say that the teacher can see it from the perspective of the student is quite a chiddush. That's the point here. Yeah.
One can understand the Mairo of a teacher seeing it from the point of view of the student. What's the Mairo what's Mairo that the Ramaira sees things from the point of view of the Ramata? What does he gain?
He doesn't use the word Lamaila. He uses the word the Ayin of the Yesh.
Understand.
So I wouldn't use the word Lamaila. What's the point?
Not the Ayin Yesh and Nivra. I'm asking if the Ein Sof. See,
It means the Achdus.
what is
It's the same reason. The same reason means that Elikus itself is so, the Achdus and the Dira B'Tachtenim is so deep that Elikus relates to us as well. Not just that we relate to God. That Elikus relates to us. It's all seamless, internalized. I mean, it's the same reason. Why is it important for the teacher to see it from the perspective of the student? Because then the teacher can relate to us better and therefore explain it better and just becomes much more internalized. The Daas Elyon, if it's only Daas Elyon, you don't have Elikus internalized as much as Daas Tachton. Daas Tachton brings Elikus on our terms. It's like asking the question, why didn't the Alter Rebbe just make the Kiddush Levana based on a miracle? Why did he need the captain to stop the ship? Because he wants Teva itself to recognize Elikus. And Elikus itself recognizes the value of that. So it's basically divine level where it recognizes the importance of seeing it from our perspective. It just makes the Achdus much deeper. Okay, let me see here. Maybe we'll stop it.
Not so easy.
Okay, V'hainu. And this means Shayesh Tefes Mokim. That's, of course, the most important point here. The Yesh is Tefes Mokim. Elikus is not saying you don't exist. I recognize that you do exist and you have a perspective. Yesh Tefes Mokim umislabish ba'ayesh shezeu sha'ir misalim. And it manifests in the Yesh, and that is the Eir shezeu sha'ir misalim. This is the meaning that the Eir gets concealed because it's subject now to the Yesh, basically. So it's concealed within the Yesh, recognizing, because if it wasn't concealed, the Yesh could not be a Yesh. Oh, wow. Let me stop here because he's going to go now into a subject that we learned earlier, the importance for the Eir to be Nesalim. Yeah.
You had mentioned that in the Rabbi's Mimer. Yeah.
If you remember, I'll just say one more thing before we end here today. In the Mimer, not in the Mimer, earlier in the volume 2, remember the big central question was, how can a post-Simpson reality experience pre-Simpson consciousness? That was like a big part of this discussion, which we're still in the middle of, frankly. And he said, the answer, he said, was we transformed the Tzimtzum. That's how you do it. But he said something very vital a while back. He said, because the Tzimtzum is really B'shvil HaGilui. And the Gilui is B'shvil HaTzimtzum. In other words, Ein Sof, before the Tzimtzum knows fully well that it's going to be subject to a Tzimtzum, there's going to be a Tzimtzum. And the Gilui is meant to permeate and shine even after the Tzimtzum, through our Aveda. The Tzimtzum is not a dead end. It's not a black hole. The Tzimtzum, its purpose is not an end in itself. It's in order to bring Gilui. So therefore, within the Tzimtzum and within the Gilui is embedded each one. Yom v'layla, if you remember, by Daita Hayoim, Yom v'layla. That makes one full day. But you need Gilui and Helam. So the Helam really has Gilui in it. The Gilui really has Helam in it. And why is it necessary? Because then you transform the entity. Because if it didn't have it, if Gilui would dominate and Helam is a stira, a contradiction to it, you can't transform the Tzimtzum. Remember, all of existence is predicated on the Tzimtzum. So essentially what he's saying here is a very similar point. That if in Elikus itself, in the Gilui of Elikus, it recognizes the importance of the Helam, not just that the Helam is for us, for the Makabel, because we can't contain this bright and intense light. That's obvious. We can't exist if the light is there because it would overwhelm us. But also Elikus recognizes the importance of the Helam. Why? Because the Eibishter wants to do it b'tachtenim. So now you have the ability to bring Elikus and Mitzias together. Because Elikus recognizes Mitzias, it's Tefes Mokim, and it's Mislabish. And it recognizes it. On the other hand, the Yesh is a Yesh, initially it's concealed, but you have now ability for these two to communicate to each other because they're on the same terms. Only one is Elikus, and the other is how the Elikus is concealed within the Yesh, Hanivra. The Elikus of the Yesh Amiti, the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, there the function is a very different one. Its function is bittul and dveikus, through attachment. So what you see here is that the fact that Elikus also has in it, embedded in it, in Daas Tachton, also in Havaya, creates a far deeper possibility to transform a world after the tzimtzum into a world before the tzimtzum, because the two ayins have something in common. But the lower level of ayin relates to our existence. So it, like in a sense, communicates on our terms. To put it in simple language, if you have a mediator between two people who have a disagreement, if the mediator only represents Daas Elyon, it's not a true mediator. If you know the mediator understands Daas Tachton and also understands our perspective, it can then be a true mediator because it understands both perspectives. So the two ayins each represent their perspective. And therefore, when they come together, you have a true harmony.
So the Kel Deus Havaya, this is in both of them, even Koidem Alei Saratzin.
Well, I don't know where you got that from, where that only comes from. Who
No,
says?
because we're talking about the Daas Tachton. The Daas Tachton is not only when it comes to Bia, to our world. Kel Deus Havaya, in the beginning, like we say, the Gvul and Bligvul is above both of them.
The Rebbe Rashab said earlier that there are three ways you can interpret the two levels of ayin. One of them was Lifnei Tzimtzum. The ayin of the Yesh Amiti is the Er Etzema Er and Ispashtus Er. The second was Sevav and Mamala, and the third was Mamala itself, two levels. If that's what you're referring to, fine. But I don't know about Kedem Alei Sarotzen. He didn't speak about Kedem Alei Sarotzen at Daas Tachton that I recall. He spoke of Daas Tachton. Once there is Alei Sarotzen, there's the Etzem Er, Ispashtus Er. But that we have to go back a few pages to see. But let's stop here. We're at middle of page 1160.